At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, the air over Doadora Airfield in New Guinea was thick with heat and the metallic tang of aviation fuel. Technical Sergeant James McKenna, his fatigues dark with engine oil, was hunched beneath the massive wing of a P-38 Lightning, watching his pilot strap in for a mission McKenna believed was suicidal. The pilot was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a pale, nervous 23-year-old with 6 combat missions and 0 kills, now flying straight toward Hornet's nest of 18 incoming Mitsubishi A6 M00s. The P-38, a beautiful twin-engine, twin-boom brute, was built for speed and high altitude, a beast in a straight line. But McKenna knew its fatal hidden flaw, a mechanical treachery that was murdering American pilots every single day. In the close quarters dance of death, the Zero was king, so light and agile, it could execute a full horizontal turn in half the time the Lightning required. American doctrine was clear. Never turn with a Zero. Use the P-38 speed advantage. Dive in, shoot, and run. But the Zeros were smart. They baited pilots into turning engagements, then slashed inside their radius, got on their tail, and pulled the trigger. The cost was staggering. The 5th Air Force had already lost 37 P-38s in the past 6 weeks, most caught in those fatal turning traps. The instructors blamed the dead men, stamping the reports with pilot error. But McKenna, the mechanic who lived and breathed the aircraft, knew the manual was lying. The problem wasn't courage. It was control cables. He had spent months tracing the P-38's aileron system, which ran through the twin booms and back to the wing control surfaces. There was slack, a terrifying, minuscule 3/8 of an inch of play at full deflection. That tiny gap created a critical life-or-death delay between the pilot's desperate stick movement and the aileron's response. At high speed, that fraction of a second, the terrifying truth was that at low speeds, during those gut-wrenching, hard-turning maneuvers, the P-38's control system betrayed the man in the cockpit. That fraction of a second delay wasn't a glitch. It was a death sentence. The precise difference between rolling inside a Zero's vicious turn and watching the enemy fighter's gun sight settle on your canopy. Mechanic McKenna had screamed this warning to the engineering officer 2 months prior, only to be met with a cold, unyielding shoulder of regulation. The cable tension was within specifications. Factory tolerances allowed for that deadly slack. Changing it, he was told, meant voiding the aircraft warranty, a bureaucratic nightmare that terrified the brass more than Japanese bullets. And besides, no grease-stained field mechanic had the authorization to touch primary flight control systems. That power resided 7,000 miles away in California, sealed within the corporate offices of Lougheed. But McKenna wasn't fighting a warranty. He was fighting for Lieutenant Hayes' life. He knew what he had to do. A direct, flagrant violation of every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. Working fast beneath the silver wing, his hands slick with engine oil and adrenaline, he scavenged a piece of high-tensile piano wire from a damaged aircraft. He cut it precisely to 6 inches, bent it into a tight Z-shape, and installed it as a crude but perfect tensioner on Lieutenant Hayes' left aileron control cable. The modification took a heart-pounding 8 minutes. It was invisible, adding a negligible 0.4 pounds of tension, but it killed the slack completely, restoring instant response. The inspection crew, focused only on routine checks of engine oil levels and ammunition loads, never noticed a tiny illegal fix. McKenna kept his silence, the secret heavy on his chest, as he watched Hayes taxi out, the roar of the engine shaking the dust. He watched the P-38 disappear into merciless morning sky toward the Japanese fighters. What happened in the next 17 minutes would determine the fate of every P-38 pilot in the Pacific Theater. McKenna was haunted by the reason he risked court-martial. The first pilot he lost to a Zero was Lieutenant David Chun, shot down on July 9, 1943. Chun had been in theater only 3 weeks. McKenna worked on his aircraft every morning. They were 2 kids from California, Chun from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach, who bonded over rebuilding engines before the war. Chun took off at 0615 on a fighter sweep overlay and came back 2 hours later, his left boom riddled with 3 bullet holes, his face pale. Chun swore Zero had gotten inside his turn. He tried to roll out and dive away like the manual demanded, but the The problem wasn't the enemy. It was a machine itself. For Chun, the P-38 Lightning became a ghost. When he jammed the stick right, the aircraft hesitated, a terrifying split-second delay between his will and the plane's response. That tiny lapse almost killed him. Only the roar of his wingman's gun saved him from a Japanese Zero whose pilot had executed flawless, terrifyingly precise deflection shooting. McKenna saw the tight cluster of bullet holes, proof the Zero pilot had perfectly anticipated where Chin should have been. But the delay had held Chin in the kill zone just long enough. Chin was grounded, his P-38 sent back to the depot for repairs. McKenna never saw him again. Just 3 weeks later, the war claimed him anyway, flying a different Lightning over a bow. The same insidious lag caught him in a turning fight. He couldn't roll out fast enough. Then came Captain William Morrison. Morrison was a veteran flight leader, an ace with 11 kills, a man who knew the P-38 inside and out. He flew smart, but even experience couldn't outrun a flaw in physics. On August 3rd, 12,000 feet above the steamy jungle canopy of Oro Bay, Morrison's flight engaged 8 Zeros. He nailed one on the first scorching pass, but when he wheeled around, 2 Zeros clawed onto his tail. McKenna later heard the chilling radio traffic. Morrison tried the desperate maneuver, rolling inverted for a split-S dive, shouting into the static, "Controls feel mushy." The Zero stayed glued to him, shattering the fuselage. The sluggish controls betrayed him, and he crashed and died at 4,000 feet. The tragedy haunted the ground crews most. Morrison's chief, a grease-stained Texas mechanic named Rodriguez, was McKenna's friend. Rodriguez was convinced the official verdict, pilot error, was a lie. With cold fury, he tore into the recovered wreckage. He checked everything: the tension of control cables, the rigging, the engine settings. He measured tolerances down to the millimeter. Everything was within spec. The paperwork cleared the machine, but it condemned the man. Rodriguez and McKenna knew the truth. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 good men vanish into clouds. The P-38 was killing them, and nobody knew why. The maintenance logs were signed, the checklist complete, yet the weight of history and the fear of loss settled heavily on the ground crews. They watched the young men taxi out, watched them roar into the sky. Some came back. Some were simply swallowed by the vast, unforgiving skies of the Pacific. The survivors all told the same unsettling story. In hard maneuvering, the mighty P-38 felt slow. There was a terrifying critical lag between the pilot's frantic control input and the aircraft's response, as if the Lightning was fighting its own harness. Most pilots dismissed it, believing it was simply the inherent sluggishness of a heavy fighter with big control surfaces. But the mechanic, McKenna, knew better. He had felt it with his own grease-stained hands. That tiny, almost imperceptible bit of slack in the complex system of control cables. It was a flaw measured not in inches, but in heartbeats. McKenna started listening closely during routine maintenance. When he plucked the taut cables, they were supposed to sing, but these gave off a low, dull twang. Every single P-38 on the line had cables technically within spec, but dangerously loose. The cost of that slack was measured in blood. After Morrison died, McKenna sought out Rodriguez one evening. Rodriguez asked a desperate question: "What can we do?" McKenna's answer was a whisper of rebellion. "Nothing official. Unofficially, there's a fix, but it requires breaking regulations that could get us both court-martialed." The pilots knew the doctrine. Every briefing emphasized the rules hammered into them during training flights. Asterisk never turn with zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Hit and run. Asterisk the manual was clear. But combat didn't read the manual. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a 23-year-old farm kid from Iowa, had been in New Guinea for 2 agonizing months. 6 combat missions, 0 kills. Not because he lacked courage, but because he obeyed the rules that kept him just outside the kill zone. On his 3rd mission, Hayes executed the dive flawlessly, building his speed to a searing 400 miles per hour, coming in from the sun just as the book instructed. He got the 0 dead center in his gun sight and began to pull lead. Then the enemy fighter snap-rolled left and dove away. Hayes tried to follow, but the fractional delay, That deadly mechanical hesitation McKenna could hear made his P-38 roll into the turn like it was moving through thick mud. By the time his Lightning responded, the Zero was gone, and Hayes was dangerously exposed. The rules were keeping them alive, but they were also keeping them from winning. The third time, Hayes hauled the yoke back, praying the twin tails of his Lightning would track the vanishing enemy. But by the time the nose of the heavy aircraft pointed where he desperately needed it, the blur of the Zero was already gone. No shot fired. Frustration curdled into pure fear on the fourth mission. At 15,000 feet, he and his wingman jumped 2 zeros. Hayes ripped off a burst, the tracers slicing harmlessly into the empty blue. The agile Zero reversed hard right, impossibly fast. Hayes rolled to follow, his muscles straining against the controls. Brake. 2 more coming high. His wingman screamed over the radio static. Hayes fought the controls, trying to roll back level and dive for the deck. The P-38 responded, yes, but with a fatal, agonizing hesitation. That fraction of a second was all the diving Zero needed. A brutal, half-second burst of 20mm cannon shells hammered his right boom. They didn't penetrate the thick skin, but the impact felt like a physical hammer blow. Engine smoking. Hayes broke off the engagement, abandoning the fight and running hard for home, shaking with pure terror. But nothing compared to the 5th mission. Hayes watched Lieutenant Thomas Parker die. Parker, only 21, from Boston, the kid he'd shared bunks and dreams with in training. On August 14th, over the jungle canopy of Finchhofen, Parker was separated, 2 zeros locked onto his tail. Hayes listened helpless as Parker fought, trying every textbook maneuver, hard rolls, reverses, scissors. The enemy stayed glued. Over the radio, Hayes heard the raw panic in his friend's voice. "I can't turn fast enough. It's not turning." Then came the ragged burst of gunfire, followed by one final agonizing scream. Then silence. That night, the squadron lay awake, haunted by the empty cot where Parker's personal effects had been quickly packed and shipped home. His P-38 was written off as a combat loss, the logbook officially recording the cause as pilot error during defensive maneuvering. But McKenna, the crew chief, who had run his hands over that aircraft just hours before the mission, checking the engine timing, the cable tension, the control surface alignment, knew the lie. The maintenance log stated, accurately, that everything was within spec. The airplane was technically fine, but Parker was dead anyway. And McKenna knew the real killer. That microscopic fraction of a second delay in controls. That tiny bit of slack the maintenance manual deemed acceptable. It was the same invisible flaw that had already murdered Morrison and Chin and 14 other good men. The worst part was the smell. Every morning McKenna worked in the... To McKenna, the maintenance area was a crucible of dread. Every lungful was a brutal mix of aviation fuel, hot metal, and the sickly sweet tang of hydraulic fluid. The very set of machines preparing to swallow young men whole. He knew the cycle, the thunderous takeoff, the agonizing wait, the fewer planes returning. And every morning, McKenna would be there, breathing in those same grim fumes, watching another pilot walk toward a P-38 that he knew, deep down, couldn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. Then, on the stifling evening of August 16th, the quiet despair became urgent. Pilot Hayes tracked McKenna down beside his assigned P-38. Hayes didn't ask, he pleaded. If there was anything at all, McKenna could do to make the Lightning roll faster. "I don't care about regulation," Hayes choked out, his voice raw. "I just need a chance." McKenna looked into the pilot's eyes and saw not swagger, but sheer, naked terror. The desperation of a kid who knew he was marked for death unless the sluggish machine beneath him could find its speed. McKenna gave the only promise he could. "Come back in the morning. I'll see what I can do." He worked in silent rebellion. After 2,300 hours, the cavernous maintenance hangar settled into an eerie quiet. The crew was long gone, leaving only the distant, reassuring grind of the generators and the frantic, suicidal buzzing of insects against the stark overhead lights. The air was thick with engine oil and smothering tropical humidity. His grease-stained hands, aching from a full day's toil, pulled the inspection panel from the left boom of Hayes' P-38. The metal was still radiating the stored heat of the day's sun. He reached inside, finding the aileron control cable snaking toward the tail section. He pulled, and he felt it. The damning, fatal give, a full 3/8 of an inch of slack before the tension caught. It was a technical flaw, yes, but for McKenna, it felt like a betrayal. He needed precision, and he needed it outside the bureaucratic chain. His mind flashed to the scrap pile. 2 weeks earlier, a P-38 had ground-looped into oblivion, but before the wreck was shipped to the depot, McKenna had salvaged a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire from its rudder trim system, a perfect, unauthorized piece of metal. He'd kept in his tool bag, a silent promise to the dead. Now, sitting alone on the hangar floor, the wire glinting under the harsh electric light, he knew exactly why. He gripped the pliers, his focus absolute, and began to bend the impossible wire, crafting a modification that would steal back that 3/8 of an inch and, perhaps, steal back a life. The piano wire was a cold, unforgiving length of steel, and McKenna needed to wrench it into a precise Z-shape. It fought back against the worn pliers, the tension so high the metal edges sliced his thumb on the second attempt. A hot flush of blood immediately made the wire slick. He wiped the crimson stain on his oil-soaked coveralls and kept grinding away, the 8 long minutes required to perfect a bend stretching into an eternity. This Z-shape wasn't just metal. It was a desperate inline tensioner, designed to add the critical preload needed to finally eliminate the deadly slack in the flight control cable. Installation was a cramped, agonizing battle. Wedged deep inside the aircraft boom structure, the cold, sharp metal edge dug mercilessly into McKenna's arm, while his shoulder pressed hard against the frame. He was forced to work one-handed, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly, casting frantic, jumping shadows across the intricate cable system. Despite the cool night air, sweat tracked cold paths down his back. The true stakes hit when he disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His suddenly clumsy fingers fumbled with the crucial clevis pin, and he heard the sickening tink, tink, tunk as it vanished somewhere deep within the boom's dark recesses. 5 frantic, sweat-soaked minutes were spent blindly searching until his fingers brushed against a tiny piece of brass. All the while, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. If the engineering officer found him performing unauthorized modifications to a critical flight control system, he faced the crushing certainty of a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, perhaps even prison time. Yet that fear was dwarfed by a single burning truth. Pilot Hayes was walking into a coffin if McKenna didn't succeed right here, right now. He finally forced the piano wire tensioner into place between the cable end and the pulley. The fit was brutally tight. He had to use sheer muscle to force the clevis pin back through the junction. When it finally seated with a solid click, he tested his desperate gamble. He pulled the cable by hand, zero slack. The control surface moved instantly, perfectly responsive. McKenna quickly secured the inspection panel, wiped the blood and grease from the wire in his hands, and slipped out of the hangar at precisely 0115. Outside, the tropical night was thick with humid stillness. Then, the low, guttural thrum of distant aircraft engines, Japanese night raiders, probably, made his stomach clench in cold dread. He had just violated a dozen regulations, used a non-standard part, and bet his entire future on a piece of bent piano wire. If this unauthorized modification failed mid-flight, Hayes would crash, and McKenna would carry the weight of that death forever. But if it worked, McKenna couldn't sleep. The ceiling of his bunk room was a canvas for his worst fears, a cold calculation of probability where Hayes might live, but many others wouldn't. At 6:30, he dragged himself to the flight line, the smell of high-octane fuel and cold engine oil sharp in the dawn air. He watched the ground crew, their hands black with grease, fuel and arm the P-38, Hayes' lightning bolt. He watched Hayes himself, silent and focused, walk out for his briefing, then hoist himself into the tight, cold cockpit. At 7:42, the engines roared, drowning out all thought. McKenna stood rigid on the tarmac and watched the twin-boom fighter climb, joining 16 other aircraft, all turning northwest toward the suffocating heat of Japanese airspace. All he could do now was endure the silence and wait for the terrible truth. The waiting ended abruptly at 8:14. 13,000 feet above the choppy, turquoise waters of the Huan Gulf, Hayes' flight of 4 P-38s found their prey, 90 enemy Zeros, flying unaware. The tactical advantage was absolute. The morning sun was a blinding, golden shield behind the American formation. Hayes, flying the crucial number 3 position, heard his element leader scream the word, "Bounce!" They rolled violently, sacrificing altitude for devastating speed. Hayes locked onto a Zero clinging to the back of the formation. He dove, the wind shrieking over his canopy, pushing the P-38 to 380 miles per hour. The Zero swelled in his gun sight. He could clearly see the blood-red rising sun painted on the fuselage, the tiny, vulnerable silhouette of the pilot's head in the glass. He pressed the trigger. The aircraft shuddered violently as 4.50 caliber machine guns and the single 20mm cannon hammered their lethal song. Tracers lashed out, but most missed. A heartbreaking few sparked uselessly off the Zero's wing. Not enough. The enemy pilot, reacting instantly, snapped his stick right and dropped away. Hayes rolled to follow, and that's when the genius of the mechanics kicked in. There was no hesitation, no hydraulic lag. The P-38, thanks to a critical, late-night modification, responded like an extension of Hayes' own nervous system. He'd never felt the fighter move with such surgical precision. Rolling 90 degrees in what felt like half the time, he instantly brought his nose down. The Zero was perfectly framed again. Hayes squeezed the trigger for a 3-second burst. This time, the rounds walked a devastating line up the enemy fuselage, stitching from tail to cockpit. The Zero's engine dissolved in a flash of fire and shrapnel. Trailing thick, black smoke, the aircraft tumbled inverted toward the distant jungle. Hayes had his first kill, but the air was already thick with danger. His wingman's frantic voice cut through the radio static. "Zero's diving. Look up." 3 enemy fighters, allies of the Zero he had just vaporized, were already hurtling down in a shallow, murderous dive. They were coming fast. The Zeros were hunting. Hayes felt the cold, sharp dread as the Japanese fighters, faster and lighter, plummeted toward him in their dive. Every piece of rigid doctrine, every instinct drilled into him, screamed to keep the throttles open, to climb hard, to run. But Hayes knew that running meant dying today, trapped and slow in the thin tropical air. He made the impossible life-or-death choice. He rolled his heavy P-38 Lightning hard left and pulled the stick back into his gut. Instead of protesting or wallowing, the big twin-boom fighter snapped around with a violent, impossible grace. The nose ripped through the horizon line, and there, filling his windscreen, was the lead Zero, turned to follow but caught completely flat-footed. The enemy pilot hadn't accounted for this unnatural reversal. Hayes, his heart hammering against his ribs, pulled lead, fired, and watched the Zero's left wing root explode. The structure folded instantly. The enemy fighter tumbled into the jungle below. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The other 2 Zeros tried to execute the deadly scissor, twisting and alternating turns to force Hayes into an overshoot. But the modified P-38 defied physics. Every time Hayes demanded a reversal, the aircraft obeyed instantly. No delay, no fighting the heavy controls. It was as if the invisible weights of drag and inertia had been surgically removed. Then one Zero committed the fatal error, reversing too hard, bleeding precious speed. Hayes slid inside his turn, closing the distance until the enemy plane filled his sight at maybe 200 feet. He squeezed the trigger. The Zero disintegrated, pieces of hot metal debris rattling against Hayes' canopy and striking his right boom, making the P-38 shudder violently. 3 kills. The 4th Zero, witnessing the impossible carnage unleashed in just 7 minutes, broke off and fled. Hayes, low on fuel and the precious heavy ammunition, didn't chase. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with the shattered remnants of his flight, and pointed the nose toward home. When Hayes finally brought the Lightning down at Doadura at 0903, his flight suit was soaked, clinging cold and heavy to his skin. His hands were shaking uncontrollably on the shut-down throttles. McKenna, the engineer who had staked his career on this radical, unofficial modification, was waiting on the flight line. Hayes climbed out of the cockpit, walked straight toward the man, and delivered the two words that changed the course of the air war. It worked. What neither man knew was that their private triumph had been witnessed by history. 6 other pilots had seen the entire, brutal engagement from 15,000 feet, including Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader in the elite 475th Fighter Group. Mitchell had been watching, and he had seen the future of air combat unfold. High above the Pacific Theater, the scream of engines was the sound of life and death. When Hayes's element dove to engage the swift Japanese Zeros below, Major Mitchell watched from the ground, gripping his binoculars. He noticed something impossible. Hayes's P-38 Lightning, notoriously heavy in a roll, was snapping through maneuvers with impossible agility, cutting through the sky like it weighed half its true mass. Mitchell was a theater expert. He knew Hayes was a good pilot, but this level of maneuverability was alien. The aircraft was different. 3 confirmed kills later, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. The adrenaline still a raw current, his hands trembling as he filed his combat report. Hayes shrugged, unable to explain the aircraft's sudden responsiveness. The trail led Mitchell, 2 hours later, to the humid, oil-soaked maintenance area and Technical Sergeant McKenna. McKenna wasn't a flyer, but he held the lives of every man in his hands. His coveralls were saturated with hydraulic fluid, his hands black with the deep, cold grease of the engine bay as he worked on a different P-38. Mitchell looked him straight in the eye. "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" McKenna paused, the weight of his secret and the risk of a court-martial hanging heavy. Then came the stark admission, the piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, an unauthorized change to the flight control system. Mitchell listened, not a technical jargon, but to a desperate lifeline. He had buried 4 pilots in his flight in the past month, all caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. Regulations meant nothing against that brutal tally. Mitchell looked McKenna in the eye. "Do it to mine." McKenna warned him of severe risks, untested, unapproved. If something went wrong, both of them would face charges. Mitchell stood firm. "I don't care. If there is something that can help him survive, I want it." That evening, under the harsh glow of the hangar lights, McKenna transferred the secret modification to Mitchell's P-38. The next morning, Mitchell flew it, returning to the base raving. He told his wingman the Lightning now rolled like a true fighter, not the lumbering truck they were used to. The word spread like wildfire through the squadron, a silent, desperate demand for survival, and by August 20th, McKenna had begun modifying every available P-38. The stakes were life and death, but the official solution was bureaucratic silence. The modification, birthed by the sheer ingenuity of men like McKenna, spread like wildfire, not through official channels, but through desperate, whispered conversations in the humid, ready rooms and under the constant glare of maintenance lights. Some crew chiefs, terrified of court-martial and regulatory violation, flatly refused to touch the flight controls. But others, seeing their pilots fly into certain death, were willing to risk everything for a fighting chance. McKenna demonstrated the illegal fix, a simple, almost crude piece of engineering. He showed them how to cut ordinary piano wire, bend it into a tight, crucial Z-shape, and install it as an inline tensioner. 8 minutes. That's all it took to transform a sluggish fighter into a deadly aerial predator. The knowledge migrated from pilot to pilot, from one grease-stained mechanic to the next. There was no official documentation, no engineering approval, just a quiet pact of men fighting for air superiority. The results were immediate and staggering. Pilot Hayes slashed down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd using the newly sharpened controls. 3 days later, on August 25th, Mitchell claimed 3. The statistics became impossible to ignore, but the proof was always in the cockpit. Consider Lieutenant James Watkins, a skeptical crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at the remote outpost of Gussap. He heard the rumor from a pilot who had transferred from Doadura. Watkins was a man who lived by the book, but he looked at his pilot, a man who had flown 8 weeks of grueling combat without a single victory, and decided the book was wrong. He risked his career, installed a tensioner on one P-38, and watched the pilot take off. When that pilot returned, he had his first kill. The choice was made. Watkins quietly modified for more aircraft, and soon other crew chiefs in the 49th followed suit. By early September, perhaps 40 P-38s across New Guinea flew with this deadly secret. The engineering officer back at Doadura noticed the anomaly in performance logs but couldn't pinpoint the cause. Why? Because the mechanics were ghosts. They would remove the tensioners just before formal inspections, then reinstall them the moment the officers walked away. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew, and together, they kept the secret that was winning the war in the air. The shift was undeniable. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific had been losing 2 P-38s for every 0 destroyed. In August, that ratio tightened to 1.3 to 1. By September, the lines were nearly even. Then the enemy noticed. Japanese fighter pilots first reported the terrifying change in late August. Flight reports filtering back to the 11th Air Fleet mentioned that the American P-38s were suddenly maneuvering with impossible aggression, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction with a brutal, unexpected speed. The war in the Pacific skies had just taken a deadly turn, and it was thanks to a bent piece of piano wire. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, 64 confirmed kills etched into his legacy, was a razor's edge of the Japanese Air Force. He had been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor, and for 2 years he and the Nimble Zero had owned the sky in the brutal dance of the turning fight. He knew the P-38's limits like the back of his grease-stained glove. Then came September 3rd, 1943, over Waiwak. Sakai engaged a P-38, pulling a standard lethal maneuver, draw the American in, wait for predictable lag as the P-38 began its roll, then snap the stick back, reversing direction to get inside the Americans' turning radius. The timing was perfect, honed over dozens of kills. But as he executed the snap, the impossible happened. The P-38 reversed with him. The American fighter, defying all known limits, rolled faster than it should have. The two aircraft hurtled toward a head-on collision, engines screaming, the cold shadow of death flashing across Sakai's canopy. He barely dove away, escaping with a hail of American bullets tearing the air where his tail had been. Sakai returned to base not wounded, but utterly confused and profoundly frustrated. His tactics, which had worked reliably for months, were suddenly failing. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently, but their aircraft were responding faster. This fractional speed increase was just enough to shatter the delicate timing the Japanese aces had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence scrambled, examining wreckage from downed P-38s, looking for new engines or armament. They found nothing visible. What they couldn't see was a genius hidden inside the P-38's boom, a simple 6-inch piece of piano wire. This wasn't a complex weapon system. It was a minor modification to control cable tension, a tweak likely made by some nameless, exhausted mechanic working late in a sweltering hangar. But that tiny, almost invisible change, that small victory of ingenuity over bureaucracy, was killing their pilots. By mid-September, the psychological impact was devastating. The Zero pilots, who had believed they owned the sky, were losing aircraft to the P-38s at rates not seen since the war's opening days, realizing their tactical superiority had vanished in the blink of an eye. The bedrock of Japanese air supremacy was dissolving beneath them. Pilots, who once pressed the attack with arrogant certainty that their Zeros could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew, now gripped their sticks with hesitant, sweaty hands. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't understand. Desperate to survive, the Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots abandoned the sacred turning fight, attempting clumsy hit-and-run passes instead. But fighting the P-38 on its terms, sacrificing Zero's core strength, its razor-sharp maneuverability, was suicide by slow motion, as the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, and could absorb far more damage. Others tried reckless aggression, closing to shorter, deadly range, believing sheer nerve could compensate. It couldn't. Aggression without the ability to outturn the enemy just meant dying faster, and by the close of September, the air had swallowed several experienced Japanese pilots trying tactics that had worked perfectly just 2 months prior in July. The fundamental, maddening problem for the 11th Air Fleet was that they were fighting a ghost, an invisible modification, They couldn't figure out how to counter. You cannot develop tactics against a change you don't know exists. The terrible toll proved the shift. By the end of September, 38 Japanese fighters had been lost in combat with P-38s. American losses in that same deadly period were 22 aircraft. The ratio had brutally reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, the P-38 Lightning was killing Zeros at a better than 1-to-1 rate. Japanese command issued the humiliating order. Pilots were to avoid engaging P-38s unless they had a significant numerical advantage. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted, and the genesis of this crushing defeat was not a research lab, but a simple, unofficial piece of piano wire. This life-saving, war-altering trick never became official doctrine. The Army Air Force Engineering Command didn't learn about the modification until October 1943. When a sharp-eyed maintenance inspector at Doedura, his hands stained with engine oil, noticed inconsistent cable tension readings. He traced the discrepancies back to those unauthorized piano wire tensioners, wrote a report, and set up the chain. For 3 agonizing weeks, that report sat on polished desks while officers debated the horror. The modification violated regulations, but it was saving lives. The proof was in the sky. Fighter squadrons running McKenna's unauthorized modification were suddenly seeing measurably better kill ratios. Pilots were coming home. But the question that hung heavy in the humid New Guinea air was not about efficacy. It was about authority. Would the brass court-martial the grease-stained mechanics who dared save lives without a signature, or would they quietly swallow their pride and approve the fix after fact? The cold weight of bureaucracy arrived in November when Lockheed dispatched an engineering team. They were thorough, meticulous men who measured the exact cable tension, calculated the precise stress loads, and ran exhaustive flight tests, comparing the official plans to the jungle rig reality. Their conclusion was inescapable. The modification was undeniably safe and effective. It should have been part of the original design. Just weeks later, in December 1943, Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the new P-38J model entering production. Yet, McKenna received no commendation, no medal, no mention. The official record was sanitized. The control system improvement was attributed merely to engineering analysis. McKenna's name was scrubbed clean from history. But the pilots remembered. Lieutenant Hay survived 63 grueling combat missions, downing 11 Japanese aircraft, and returned safely to the quiet field of Iowa in 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and spent 37 years working as a crop duster, the smell of engine oil still thick in his life. Every year, without fail, on August 17th, Hayes picked up the phone and called McKenna, a ritual of gratitude for the life he was still living. Mitchell also survived, rising to squadron commander, leading his unit through the brutal Philippines campaign and achieving 16 confirmed kills. He stayed in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. To every young maintenance officer he supervised, Mitchell told a vivid, powerful story of McKenna's modification, ensuring they understood that sometimes the most critical solutions are born not from the slide rules of engineers, but from the desperate, ingenious hands of enlisted mechanics who truly see the problem. McKenna himself stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to California, and went back to his true calling, opening his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. He worked on engines for 42 more years, a quiet man who never talked much about the war. When pressed, he would simply say he was a mechanic. He fixed airplanes, that's all. A dedicated historian, driven by a whisper in the maintenance logs recovered from the sweltering humidity of New Guinea, tracked the ghost of forgotten fix, the unauthorized piano wire tensioner. The trail led not to an engineer, but to a name, McKenna. Through veteran registries, the historian found James McKenna, then 73 years old, still working part-time in a dusty garage that smelled of old oil and aviation fuel. When confronted with a life-saving modification, McKenna simply confirmed the story, shrugging off the ingenuity. Wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. Yet, the cold mathematics of war told a different story. Based on the stark improvement in survival rates among squadrons using his fix, the historian estimated McKenna's quiet rebellion may have snatched between 80 and 100 American pilots from the unforgiving skies. McKenna said he never counted. He only remembered the faces of the young men, Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, the others, who walked away because of a few feet of wire. That, he insisted, was enough. James McKenna died in 2006 at age 88, buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary proudly noted his service as a World War II aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner. It did not mention that he had fundamentally altered how the legendary P-38 Lightning flew. It did not mention that he had deliberately broken regulations to save lives. That garage in Long Beach is still there, different owner now, but on the back wall, a faded photograph remains. A young, grease-stained mechanic in coveralls, standing defiant next to his fighter. The date scrawled on the back is August 1943, New Guinea. This is how innovation truly happens in war. Not through official channels or cautious engineering committees, but through the hands of sergeants and mechanics who see the problem, find a radical solution, and never wait for permission to save a life. These untold histories matter. They deserve to be remembered,